Welcome in a new episode of the podcast Rassegna Caffè Live. Today I'm very excited because this episode will be in English and we're going to talk about Shakespeare in movies, so Shakespeare's modern adaptation. And with us today to talk about it, there's Trinity Crowther. Trinity got a BA and an MA, so a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in both in English literature at the prestigious University of Warwick. And both her dissertation were on Shakespeare. So she's an expert on Shakespeare. She specialized on Shakespeare, and the University of Warwick, it's actually in the same county Shakespeare lived, so very near Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born and raised. But yeah, I told you everything now. I mean, I'm not the expert on Shakespeare, so I should definitely leave the speech to Trinity. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for your time and for talking about Shakespeare with us. It will be very, very interesting, I'm sure about it.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'm really excited to be on. I always love your podcast. Where to start? So I've always liked Shakespeare. I first encountered Shakespeare at school, which I think is true for many people. And I think that can be a double-edged sword because, when you interact with, say, Shakespeare through the prism of school, it's often very restrictive. You've got to read this scene or this play, and then you've got to analyze it. And I feel that often takes the joy and the fun out of Shakespeare. And really, Shakespeare was meant to be enjoyed. And I feel like we have sapped the enjoyment out of Shakespeare and watching it sometimes, which is why I wanted to talk about Shakespeare in movies. Because a lot of the movies that I want to talk about are considered Shakespeare. So, 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, more recently, Anyone But You, though that is a looser adaptation. But they bring so much joy when you're watching them. And I think it's really sad that we don't respect them more as, homages to Shakespeare and adaptations of Shakespeare. Shakespeare has grown into this like massive cultural touchstone that so many people are afraid of. Oh, I can't understand Shakespeare, Shakespeare isn't for me. But I think films like 10 Things I Hate About You or She's the Man or films like that, they break down the barrier. There's sort of a barrier separating, non-scholars from appreciating Shakespeare. And I think that's so important because when Shakespeare started out, he was writing for everybody, rich people, poor people, everybody in between. They were all coming to watch his plays. Theatre was lowbrow entertainment at this point in history. They had to be banished to the south side of London. They weren't allowed within city limits. It makes me really frustrated that Shakespeare is now a figure of elitism that it shouldn't be that way. And of course,
it should be a popular figure that we should enjoy. And as you say, many scholars don't approve much of these movies, of these modern adaptations, because they would prefer William Shakespeare to be on a shelf, to just be studied, analyzed, and see, philological reasons within the text. So a very much thorough study of the play. While, as you do, I think it's much more enjoyable, and at the same time, probably Shakespeare would have loved it more to see his plays adapted in modern days and, just entertaining new generations.
And I think Shakespeare would have understood, the Shakespeare plays, which Shakespeare is defined as, works of Shakespeare that situate themselves in modern popular culture. So they take themselves completely out and they use Shakespeare in a modern way. And I think Shakespeare would much he would understand it much more from that perspective than he would of a lot of modern productions. You know, when you go to the theatre and it's very artistic and intellectual. And I think Shakespeare would be there thinking, was not what I was intending. You know, I was intending for this to be an enjoyable, you know, it was an escape from life. But now for some people, it's a chore. You know, you go, oh no, I've got to read Shakespeare. But it should be such a joy. You know, there's a reason Shakespeare has lasted for like nearly 300 years. I think, was it 2012? It might have been, was 300 years since he was born, you know, and so few authors have the staying power of that. You know, there are many modern authors that, you know, 50 years ago, they were massive, they were the big thing, but now we don't know them anymore. Shakespeare, there is a reason he has lasted so long. And I think this air of like mysticism and intellectualism that surrounds Shakespeare, you know, traditional Shakespeare productions is often really off-putting, and it prevents Shakespeare from being accessible for a wider audience, which is what he should be accessible for a wider audience. Sorry, I'm just going on a bit of a rant.
It's a very interesting affirmation of yours, considering that you are a scholar and you graduated on Shakespeare. So you know Shakespeare from another point of view too, which is, you know, the academic point of view, which of course it's not intended to be understood by many, because if you choose to study Shakespeare, you choose to study more specific, I mean, more specific thoughts or points of view, or just studies or essays about Shakespeare. So what you're saying is very interesting, because you think Shakespeare should be for everyone, not just for an elite of scholars. And I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about Shakespeare and this, you know, popular way of intending Shakespeare, you quoted a few movies before. So you quoted She's the Man and 10 Things About You, and even if it's quoted in a, I mean, not in a like scene by scene way in Anyone But You, but even Anyone But You's got Shakespearean references. So how can we find Shakespeare in those adaptations?
So I'll start with Anyone But You, because that's a shorter one. With that, the bones of the story are taken from Shakespeare's play, Much Ado About Nothing, which is quite a popular play, even with modern audiences in a more traditional production, because it is really actually quite funny, and the chemistry at the heart of the play really does work. And so what they did was they had, between different sections of the film, they used quotations from the play, and they also had scenes that were like a homage to scenes from the original play. One of the most noticeable, like one of the scenes that worked the best, in my opinion, was in Much Ado About Nothing. There are scenes where they are tricking the main characters into realizing that they are in love, and they try and do this in Much Ado About Nothing, but the characters show an awareness, oh, this is what you are trying to do, because it was already done in the play. And they have this really interesting, you know, the characters are playing versions of Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing, but they know of Beatrice and Benedict, and they don't realize that they are playing out the same story. And it was a really clever little dig at the fact that they knew they were adapting Shakespeare, and they knew it wasn't serious. And I liked that light-hearted tone that they took with it. She's the Man, that is an adaptation of Twelfth Night, and I've got to be honest, I think in some ways it works better than the original play. That might be a controversial opinion, but the end of Twelfth Night is not entirely happy. You know, there are seeds of discord there. You know, we have Malvolio, he disappears off, whereas She's the Man entirely adapted it and made it fully a rom-com, and it made it, you know, for a modern audience, we could enjoy it and be like, yes, I'm rooting for these characters, in the way that it would have been in Twelfth Night. They would have been, oh yeah, we're happy, you know, the status quo has been, you know, restored and everybody's got married. But obviously in a modern rom-com, I feel like marriage is not usually the goal as much. And then my favorite of the three, 10 Things I Hate About You. It's a lot of people's favorite Shakespeare adaptation. It's probably the one that did the best, other than Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet. That actually contributed to the start of the Shakespeare movement.
I like
10
that
Things I Hate
movie.
About You. Yeah, it's a very good movie. 10 Things I Hate About You takes one of Shakespeare's probably most controversial plays, The Taming of the Shrew, that a lot of modern audiences find extremely unpalatable. You know, Petruchio in Taming of the Shrew, he is not pleasant at all. He is very cruel to his wife. And at the end, you know, there is a debate. Does Catherine tongue-in-cheek know that she's hoodwinked him by being the perfect wife, or has he just broken her spirit? And the beauty of 10 Things I Hate About You is they took such a controversial play and they made it not into a, you know, beat by beat, not into a beat by beat comparison, but they made it better and they improved on it. And I think that's the thing with Shakespeare, you know, it shouldn't be a static text. We should build on it. And I think actually, you mentioned earlier, you know, I have done degrees and, you know, I've studied Shakespeare and from an academic perspective. And I actually think that solidified my opinion that Shakespeare should be a living, breathing text, you know, that we should keep adding to from a modern perspective. Because I often felt I struggled with the original text. You know, I found it hard to get into it. And, you know, I was studying it from an academic perspective. And if anyone should feel it's easy to study Shakespeare, you know, it should be someone who's doing a degree that, you know, features Shakespeare. But even I struggle, you know, I go to the theatre and some performances are really hard to fully appreciate and understand because we simply don't have the same set of cultural references that the people of Shakespeare's time would have had. You know, we don't understand that in the same way. You know, we don't have the religious references, we don't have the socio-political references, and it's just much harder to understand it. So by putting Shakespeare and taking his genius and applying it to our modern works, I think it allows Shakespeare to be new and exciting and to pass down from generation to generation. And I think that's really important. Like I saw a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the RSC recently with a friend. And my friend has not watched much Shakespeare, you know, she's not a Shakespeare fan, like, and we went and we laughed the whole way through, and everyone else in the audience laughed. It was a production featuring Matt Baton, who, for UK listeners, is quite well known for Horrible Histories and Ghosts, both of which are kind of comedy historical shows. And so it's very much in his niche to do Shakespeare. And a lot of people were drawn to watch this production because of the marketing that focused on his role in the play. But it really worked. He made Shakespeare, you know, it was a traditional production. They weren't speaking modern English, but it was just so funny. You could understand it. The physical humor really helped. We were sat next to a group of 20 somethings, and they were like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like watching Love Island. And it's that ability to, you know, cross history and reach across time and say, yes, that piece of literature, it still speaks to things that humanity understands in the 21st century. You know, humans haven't changed that much. And I think putting Shakespeare on a shelf and saying, oh, you know, wow, look what he created. I feel like it undersells, his genius. We should allow him to evolve with us.
It's
Um,
true. And he invented rom-coms before there were
mm,
no, as you told me. That was such
yeah.
an interesting affirmation. It's true. He invented rom-coms even before, I mean, his rom-coms ended up with marriages, but like Jane Austen novels did, like we
Mm,
knew in our culture you don't get married. I mean, it depends, of course, on people and what you want to do, but usually
mm,
you don't get married when you finish high school. So it's like rom-coms that are set in high schools, like 10 Things About You. She's the man.
mm.
Marriage is not the ending, the
No,
perfect
not
ending.
the end goal.
No, but they're all happy, and that's a, that's a modern perspective too. Another ending which is as happy as, I mean, Shakespeare's one, but at the same time adapted to our days. I wanted to ask
Mm,
this last question, just because I think it's pretty interesting to know, uh,
mm,
for our listeners, of course, and our viewers on YouTube. There's lots of doubts around Shakespeare's existence, because, like, let's think about Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is the English adaptation of a
mm,
novel by Luigi da Porto, which set the novel in Verona, and Shakespeare retook the same Italian adaptation, but was based on another Italian novel set in Siena in Tuscany. So
yeah.
some people say Shakespeare might have not been a person, but a group of comedians that just
Mm,
took comedies from abroad and rewrote them in English. I personally think that William Shakespeare existed, but
mm.
I want to know your opinion about it.
I think I think this again plays into the status Shakespeare has now reached in modern society. You know, he is the canon. He is literature. You think of Shakespeare and you go, oh my God. And I think people don't want to think that one man who came from a fairly normal background, who was educated not to a high standard. He wasn't aristocracy. He didn't have access to the best tutors. He didn't speak lots of different languages. And people don't want to think that a man like that could have affected the course of literary history so much. It's a sort of cultural snobbery, in my opinion. I firmly believe that Shakespeare existed. I firmly believe he wrote his plays. Yes, he did collaborate with people, especially towards the end of his life. But many of his greatest plays he did write, and we should appreciate that. Anyone can write a brilliant book or novel or play, and I feel like we shouldn't undersell Shakespeare by trying to post death, take away his achievements. There's people who say, oh, Shakespeare, some aristocrat was writing these novels and plays and poems and just passing them off to Shakespeare, and he was just acting the part. I just think, no,
It's not.
no.
I mean, we should consider that Shakespeare's influence went all around the world because, of
Mm,
course, movies like 10 Things About You are
mm,
American. So
yeah.
he managed to go to other continents as well as to other countries in Europe. Because, for example, in Rome, there's a copy of the Globe Theatre in Villa Borghese,
Mm,
which is a very big park, and it's been like built with like it's a wooden structure very similar to the
mm,
London one. So Shakespeare is very much appreciated worldwide, and I think this is even because many people appreciate him not just from a scholar perspective, so they don't just
mm,
leave him on the shelf, but they appreciate the Romeo and Juliet movies and even
mm.
the movies that don't have the same exact title as the play, but
Yeah.
another adaptation of the play. Lastly, and then thank you so much for your time. I would love to ask you if you have some books or essays or movies to recommend to our listeners about Shakespeare.
Definitely. Well, first of all, go out and watch 10 Things I Hate About You, because if you haven't already, it's just a really nice movie. It's really great, and I think it speaks to what Shakespeare is really about. It speaks to our humanity, our ability to grow and change as people. And, you know, it's just a great movie. I love it. There are some more academic books. I'm just going to check the title because I had written it down, but I've now forgotten. Let me just check.
No, I mean, there are so many books, so it must be very difficult to forget, I mean, to
Oh,
remember.
the one that I really loved and appreciated whilst I was writing my first dissertation, which was about 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, and also an adaptation of Othello that was also done in the early 2000s. Shakespeare and Modern Popular Culture by Douglas Lanier. He writes a whole book about Shakespeare's presence in pop culture and how that intersects. And that was a really interesting overview of the topic as a whole, if you're really interested in it. And then there are lots of other ways to, interact with Shakespeare. There are a lot of modern productions now that put Shakespeare in modern dress, or they adapt it. I think there was recently one where they did Shakespeare's, I think it might have been Romeo and Juliet, and they did it entirely online. So it was performed through YouTube videos and Twitter and things like that. And I think Shakespeare would have really liked that. Imagine Shakespeare with Twitter. He would have had the best time. I think he would have loved it. He'd have been getting to the end of the word count and be like, no, I need to write more, because I think he would have loved modern social media. I think he would have written a few plays about that, I think.
Yeah, sure. I think that too. And in his comedies, you can even, I mean, find sometimes parody or satire about the society he lived in. I think the great thing about comedy, of course, even let's remember all the tragedies he wrote, but sometimes you can, just hate some opinions on what's going on throughout what people say. So I think he was a genius, and what he did is very remarkable. And the fact that he's surviving after 300 years, he's been dead for quite some time now. But whenever you think about English literature, the first thought is about William Shakespeare. So he must be remembered, and it's very, very cool that he's remembered even through movies and plays that managed to adapt him in a more modern perspective. So, yeah.
The thing is, the ghost of Shakespeare is everywhere in modern culture. All sorts of different films and movies, like we were saying, modern rom-coms owe so much to Shakespeare. So many of the plots are based on the same ideas of, oh, you bring a couple together, you bring them apart, and then you've got to do, how do they get around the obstacles? And Shakespeare defined that genre, and we are still reworking it now, 300 years later. The man's not a genius. I don't know how to describe him.
He was a genius. Now that you say that, I think he might have taken inspiration for this, lovers being together, then part with the various obstacles, then together, with a genre from the ancient Greek literature, which was called, I think, Greek novel, in which it was very common to have these, books or just poems. I had to translate lots of them about just lovers being together, then being separated, even because, I don't know, they had to go on trips and one of them, the boat sank, and then they had to be reunited. So it's so cool that he managed to take that again, because after the ancient Greek literature, it was all, kind of forgotten, and then Shakespeare was able to bring it back. And even he did, if you think about it, he managed to modernize that too in his time. So if he did that,
That's
why can't we? Yeah.
Yes, even after Shakespeare's death, very soon after, people were already adapting and changing it. Let me just check the name of the gentleman, but there was a restoration, I think he was England's first poet laureate, John Dryden. So he adapted Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which was already, Shakespeare was already adapting the story of Troilus and Cressida already. Dryden adapted it, and he was so nervous about what his contemporary audience were going to say in response. He had the ghost of Shakespeare speak a prologue and say, "This is great, you should like my play, I approve this adaptation." You know, we as humans have always adapted things, and we always will. But I think with Shakespeare, there is now this real anxiety around adapting it. And, oh, it's the bard, we can't dishonor his work. But even like a couple of, well, not a couple, but even in the Restoration, which relatively was very close in time to Shakespeare, people were already changing and adapting Shakespeare. And 300 years after, we should definitely be able to adapt and change Shakespeare. We don't want to be like the Victorians. They were obsessed with trying to make Shakespeare plays as traditional and authentic as they possibly could, from the costumes to the stages. But you can never make something truly authentic. Once a moment has gone, you can never fully recapture that. And I think that's why we should just change Shakespeare in homage to him, of course, but he shouldn't stay static, because he can't stay static. We have a different set of cultural experiences through which we will read and understand him. Yeah.
This was
Yeah.
very interesting to hear, and I know I said interesting a lot during this podcast, so I apologize to the listeners for my vocabulary. It wasn't always very extensive, but I think I want to thank you again, Trinity, so much for being here with us today, because talking about English literature, it's always very meaningful to me, because I personally appreciate it a lot, and I studied Shakespeare too, but my study was more on the 12th Night, which is another very important piece of his work, but from a very traditional point of view. So
Yeah.
your perspective on Shakespeare is very passionate, and I think it adds something more to the podcast, because you studied English literature. I mean, you're talking to us from England right now, so you are a local, a native, and thank you again for your time, and I hope now all the listeners and the viewers will go watch 10 Things I Hate About You, and let us know in the comments what you think about it. It's the first time I say it. Let us know in the comments.
Thank you very much for having me. Sorry for being so excited. Shakespeare gets me really
No, don't be
passionate.
sorry. It's amazing. I'm the same with Dante Alighieri. I'm exactly the same. So I totally understand you. It's amazing. Thank you so much, Trinity.
Thank
Thank
you for
you.
having me. And remember, Shakespeare is for everybody, not just for bookshelves.
It is.
Thank
I mean, not it. He is definitely. Thank you, and
Thank
see you soon in the next
you. See
episode
you
of
soon.
Rassegna
Bye-bye.
Caffè Live. Bye bye.